Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing okay. And well, today I will be presenting the multilingual brain implications for the future. So this is the outline of my presentation. As you see, I will cover 4 different topics throughout this presentation. So first, we're going to start with introduction, and well, it is important that we remember that much of the knowledge about cognitive brain functions comes from the modular approach, and whereas this approach has been helpful because we can see which areas in the brain are active while we carry out different activities, these ideas or these views are simplistic because it is not possible to say that only this region is responsible for a specific task or for only one task or cognitive function. Therefore, it is necessary to see what is going on inside the brain that we're going to call the subcortical area. So why is a high complexity approach needed? Well, as I was telling you, it is not possible to believe that only one brain area is responsible for one activity. Instead, it is necessary to see our brain as what it is, a complex and a collaborative work that is going to help us transfer information from one place to the other. So that is what we call brain networks, okay? These little dots are called network nodes, and they carry out specific information that is different from other nodes. However, in order to communicate from one another, they need these brain networks. And these brain networks are going to carry out local information, but also information that is not near them. Regarding second language learning, it is important to see how these large-scale networks are going to serve second language learning or third language learning. And also, this high complexity approach is going to help us see how neural networks change throughout time or when a task in a second or third language is active, right? So then moving on to the more complex parts of this chapter, we're going to talk about the outer brain networks for language. And well, remember that the studies presented in the chapter, most of them were considering that vocabulary learning is going to help us see how these brain networks work, right? Therefore, they decided to conduct studies in naming because it is regarded as a proficiency performance, okay? So some of the studies that I found interesting were those of Richardson et al. In 2010, and they found that increased gray matter, when people were learning new vocabulary, or the acquisition of new vocabulary led to an increase in gray matter in the left inferior parietal cortex. So remember that this is your parietal lobe, and well, the gray matter was found in the left inferior parietal cortex. This would be here, right? Another study that I found interesting was that of Micheli et al. In 2014, and they studied monolinguals and early and late bilinguals. And they discovered that there was an increase in gray matter, but this time it was in a different region. This region is called the posterior supramarginal gyri, okay? So that is going to be here. And well, in this study, they also found that there were dynamic structural changes, that vocabulary learning leads to structural changes in our brain. And then another study was that of Lee et al. In 2007, and they studied monolingual adolescents. And they found that even though when you are monolingual, there is also an increase in gray matter when you are learning vocabulary. And they also found similar results, that gray matter was in the supramarginal gyri. Here. And they mentioned, or something important about this is that those people were not proficient in, or did not have verbal fluency, but that didn't account for the development of gray matter. Actually, that didn't affect it. And they didn't pay attention to other cognitive abilities, right? Other studies regarding gray matter and the development of vocabulary were the first one is Stein et al. Conducted in 2012, and they studied English native speakers who moved to Switzerland, and they found that gray matter developed in the left inferior frontal gyrus. So remember that this part of your brain is going to be the frontal lobe. So in this case, the gray matter was found here, right, in this part of the brain. And another study conducted by Abutalebi et al. In 2015, they were interested in seeing the differences between monolinguals and bilinguals, but those elderly people. And well, they found gray matter in the inferior parietal lobes, so that is going to be here. And they discovered that being bilingual or multilingual has a neuroprotective effect. So that means that when we are able to learn another language, that is going to help our brain lessen the damage or lessen the effect of aging, which is really interesting. And well, the last study that I want to show you about vocabulary learning and the development of gray matter is that of Burgaleta et al. Conducted in 2016. And well, they discovered that subcortical gray matter was found in the bilateral putamen and thalamus, right? So as you can see here, this is going to be the thalamus and the putamen is going to be here. Okay, but also the findings reveal that subcortical structures in bilinguals significantly expanded. So that indicates that there are different structures that are being affected or helped by being able to learn or speak another language, right? So it's not only about brain regions, but now we're seeing in the subcortical areas and how they transfer information and how they help each other and how they change and modify when we learn another language. Then, so what does this mean? Well, it means that learning another language, of course, is going to help our brain or affect our brain on our brain networks. And brain mapping, which is something that I showed you, like the colors in the brain, shows the changes in the brain and shows what regions are affected or activated when we're speaking another language, okay? And that these changes involve many regions of the core network. The core network is the most important network, right? And some of the regions are affected. So that means that the core network is also playing a role when we're learning, for example, in this case, vocabulary. However, there are some downsides of these studies because brain mapping does not provide enough information on the core network. So even though we know that it comes into play, there is not enough information. And because it's believed that the core network is different in bilinguals and multilinguals compared with monolingual people. Thus, Garcia-Penton et al. In 2014 addressed this issue, but they used a different experiment, which is called the functional approach. And well, this had some advantages because it provided a more complex interpretation. And the findings revealed that early acquisition of two languages may help specialized structural subnetworks develop. So that means that when we learn our language when we are children, we have to develop, or our brain has to develop these networks in order to carry out different activities related to language learning. But some of the shortcomings were that the emergence of these subnetworks was associated with less efficient information transfer in the whole brain. That is to say that since we are learning a new language, there are more ways that our brain needs to transfer information and process information. So they believe that this transfer of information is less efficient because now our brain has more things to do and more information to process, right? So then that's why many people thought, is there really a bilingual advantage? Is there really this neuroscientific explanation that a bilingual brain has advantages? So then that's why then also investigators were looking at how the executive functions network is extended and how it comes into play when we are carrying out activities in another language. And well, there were some experiments. For example, they mentioned that language switching could help see which of the areas of the executive functions were activated when we were carrying out different activities. And the idea here is that bilinguals perform better than monolinguals in non-linguistic executive functions, okay? So that means that even though if you are not carrying out an activity that has to do with language, you as a bilingual person are going to be better than a monolingual. And these two authors, Bielstock and Hakuta, they mentioned that yes, it is probable because of course learning and using two languages leads to cognitive demands. So you have to do more activities and your brain has to work more. However, in 2012, Stocko et al. Indicated that there is no bilingual advantage, that of course there is an advantage, but it is a cognitive advantage. And because you have to complete different activities, but these activities, for example, are not separated. Like, for example, when you are memorizing how to drive a car, being a monolingual, that is exactly the same path that a bilingual brain is going to use in order to memorize vocabulary. So it doesn't mean that a bilingual has like another system, but that in doing specific activities, these activities are going to use the same path that you have in your brain that are going to help you, in this case, memorize information, right? So since these investigators were into language switching, there were some experiments, and well, I'm going to show you some of them. And well, the first experiment was the Switch Coast, and the pioneers were Mutter and Alport, and then Stocko et al. And they had this experiment in which they showed pictures and the bilinguals had to mention the objects. For example, they showed two consecutive objects, and in non-switch trials, they had to name these objects in the same language. So I have an example here. I'm going to show you two objects and you use Spanish, for example. Right? So you should have said hamburguesa and globo, right? But then in switch trials, they use different languages. So the first object now, you are going to say it in Spanish, and the second, you are going to say it in English, okay? So here we go. Right? So you should have said martillo, book, right? So the findings, of course, were something that investigators were expecting because in switch trials, when you switch from one language to another, it takes longer for you to mention or to switch from one place to the other, right? Well, not place to the other, from one language to the other. And these were, of course, expected because your brain has to do like or process specific information, see the picture, and of course, select the language that should be used, right? So this was one of the experiments. Another experiment was the inhibition control. And it was conducted by, well, the inhibition model was proposed by Green in 1998, and then some experiments were conducted by Jackson et al. In 2001. And then in this experiment, you are going to be given pictures, for example, or words, and then inhibition refers to controlling your impulses. So in this case, for example, if I show you a word in Spanish, the instruction says that you have to tap on your desk, no? I hope you can hear that. But if you see a word in English, then you have to control your impulse, right? So I'm going to show you just like a sample. This is not a real experiment, but I hope you can follow along. And well, so when you see a word in Spanish, you tap. When you see a word in English, you don't tap, right? right? So this is just a sample, and well, this is what the inhibition control in no-go response experiments look like. And well, the findings were that inhibition control, which is one of the executive functions, plays a role in language switching. But Costa and Santesteban in 2004 mentioned that inhibition may play a role in unbalanced bilinguals, because they also conducted an experiment and they perceived that unbalanced bilinguals had more difficulty switching from one language to the other because the proficiency was not the same. And that inhibition is not used in balanced bilinguals, because a balanced bilingual may be really acquainted with both languages, and then switching from one to the other is not that difficult, right? There were other studies also in the chapter, and as you have read, the findings are contradictory. Some of them say that inhibition is part of language learning or language switching, sorry, and others say that it is not, that we need to pay attention to error recognition perhaps, or being flexible, which is another executive function, right? So then, in general, the language switching studies include methodical problems and misinterpretations and misapplications. So when we are reading about these type of experiments in language switching, it is important that we consider these three questions. How is proficiency judged in each study? How is bilingualism defined? And how adequate are the neuroscientific studies used? Okay, so these are very important, because remember, when we're conducting a study, that doesn't mean that our study is going to give like the one and possible answer to the problem we are looking at, okay? And well, as we read, many language switching studies provide different results. It can be inferred that language switching is not exclusively related to language networks. There are other functions that come into play when we are switching languages, and that many areas of the brain become active when a person switches between languages, okay? So, well, this was the second part. In general, we can say that yes, executive functions come into play, like inhibition or being flexible when we are carrying out tasks in another language, but it's not only that executive functions are the responsible ones for language switching or language processing. And well, finally, talking about bilingual advantage, there was this accepted view that bilinguals are better than monolinguals at non-linguistic tasks. And this idea has been criticized. And it has been criticized because recent research has found that there are more disadvantages. As I told you before in this presentation, they state that there are more subnetworks, and that the transfer of information is less efficient, and then that perhaps a bilingual brain is confused, right? And Pap et al. Also questioned this idea of bilinguals being better than monolinguals, because he said, like, the studies that are there, the proportion of positive results is small compared to all the results that research has yielded. And then they also mentioned that brain imaging studies do not support the bilingual advantage hypothesis. And another disadvantage was that behavioral studies could not be replicated, that the results are contradictory, and that there is no evidence from neuroscientific investigators, right? So, well, in conclusion, I can tell you that yes, as we have read, bilingualism affects different brain regions that mediate language abilities, but also it affects regions that have nothing to do with language learning, as we were mentioning, executive functions. Our understanding will depend on the theoretical frame. And remember, we need to consider that past studies can be convergent and divergent. That is to say that there is no one an exclusive answer to the problem we are looking at, or to the functions of a bilingual or multilingual brain. And therefore, the chapter and the researchers proposed that better tasks, experimental and statistical methods are included in future research because we are just barely understanding how a multilingual brain works, right? So I hope you have liked this presentation. These are my references, and well, thank you very much for your attention. I will see you in class next week. Have a nice one. Take good care. Bye-bye.